A common comment that myself and many colleagues write on assessments for students is that it needs to engage in more analysis. In particular, this will be seen on assignments that are getting a mark in the 50s, where the student has shown that they have an understanding of the key issues, but they haven't gone beyond that. And also perhaps in a student who's getting a late 60s, but not quite getting the first. They are engaging in analysis, but are not enough analysis. So let's have a think about what analysis is and how you can do more of it in your assignments. Well, the first thing we have to think about in terms of analysis is that we have to, what stage one is. And stage one is really thinking and reflecting rather than doing. So analysing is an action, but in order for us to be able to analyse, we have to first be able to think and reflect. So when you have read all of the material you're going to read in preparation of your assessment, you need to then step back and think about how your thinking has been affected by what you've read, and what your main arguments are, what you think is correct, what you might query, how you're going to build up your arguments, and all of this requires thinking and reflection before you ever start to write. So the analysis happens right back at that stage. The second thing that you have to do in order to engage in analysis is you need to ask questions. So when you've got your thoughts together in stage one, you then need to ask questions about, well, why do I think that's happening? How am I going to argue my case in that way? What are others saying that are different to my view? Or are there lessons I can learn from something else? And all of these challenges, if you like, are queries and questions that make yourself think much more deeply about the area or the issue that you're writing about. And by doing this, what they are doing is making you be more analytical, making you think in more depth about the topic that you're about to write your assessment on. One thing that students sometimes find difficult in terms of analysing is that you have to make a clear argument that you are going to put on the page and stand over. And these assertions and points are defended by your reading in the literature, or your experience, or your knowledge, or case studies. But you have to have clear arguments that are being made. And you have to, if you like, pin your colours to the mast in that way. By doing that, you are again being more analytical, because you are taking a position which you then must defend. So it's taking you away from that safeness of reporting what other people in the literature are saying and moving into a zone in which you are making an argument which you are then defending. In order to analyse effectively, you have to tease out points and explore issues. And this is often a comment again that I write on assessments, where I might see a student writes one sentence and I think, oh, that's a really interesting point, but they don't defend it. They don't keep going with it. And it's as if they are cautious or unsure that they have a valid argument to make, but you must explore issues in order to be able to analyse them. If you're simply looking at the top of the ocean, all you're doing is describing to me what the ocean looks like. In order for you to be able to explain why the ocean looks and performs like it does, you need to get down underneath it onto the seabed in order to investigate what's going on underneath. And by exploring that issue, you are able to properly analyse what you're looking at up on the ocean bed, on the top of the water. So let's look at an example now to see how in a written piece of work you can be more analytical. So this is a paragraph that I've written which talks about globalization and tourism. And straight away, just looking at it, I can see that there is engagement with literature by seeing the references here in brackets. I can see that they're dealing with key issues in terms of internationalization, multinational hotels, but they're thinking about destinations and they're also thinking about service impacts. So they're hitting all of the key issues that I would expect to see in a piece of work like this. But if I was reading a paragraph like this, what I would be writing in the margins over here was analyse these issues more. So let me show you what I mean and how I would do this. So I'm going to go through it and look in some of the sentences and think about how you could tease out these issues more in order to provide a more analytical piece of work. So this first sentence: tourism operates within a global context, and so our understanding of globalization is extremely important. I absolutely agree with this statement, and it's a very good lead-in contextual sort of sentence to have at the beginning of the paragraph. But what I would be expecting now is that the student digs into that issue a little bit more, instead of moving on to another topic. So what strikes me here straight away is that, well, the student is saying that globalization is important, but what about local issues? Do they matter? And then, even more deep again, do they matter more than or the same amount as global issues. So what I'm doing then is that I'm challenging the student to think more about the one sentence and to dig deeper and to start explaining to me in much more detail, teasing out the issue more. And now what I'm expecting is a whole paragraph that's going to be written here about globalization, localization and glocalization. Straight away what that's doing is giving me or allowing the student to give a perspective on an issue. So let's look now at multinational hotels, which they deal with here in quite good detail. And so they're telling me about the literature and the key areas that the literature looks at. But then I start to think about, well, do all hotels, let me just put this in red just so that you can see it. So do all hotels expand? And we know the answer to that is no. So why not? What makes some hotels more likely to internationalize than others? Then if we start thinking about where they internationalize to, well, we know that many multinational hotels locate in neighboring and culturally, and that includes language, culturally similar areas. So because of that then, where does that lead us in our thinking? To what extent are these hotels actually multinationals at all? So you can see there that what I've done, I suppose, is that by introducing these sorts of issues, I have made the conversation much more complex and complicated. And in that way, I'm analysing. I'm bringing the student into more difficult discussions, which will allow them to give more depth of analysis and depth of discussion. And let's look then at this last one here, McDonaldization. And so this is obviously a really interesting area that actually could lead to a whole essay in itself. But we need to think a little bit more. Is this too, sorry, I'll just put it in red again just so you can see it. So is this too simplistic? What about the fact that tourists often use McDonald's as a rest from local experiences? What about the fact that McDonald's do offer different menus in different places? And so I could go on. And so what I suppose I've done here by putting in red some questions is that I'm showing you how you can be analytical by asking questions and by teasing out issues more. So those things that I spoke about earlier in terms of exploring issues more, in terms of asking questions, in terms of reflecting and thinking in more depth. And by doing that, what you can then see is you can see a much, much stronger piece of work, which is more complex and more complicated and is absolutely more analytical. So, to conclude then, in order to analyse, you have to do these things. You have to think and reflect, you have to ask questions, you have to build arguments, and you have to tease out and explore issues. And by doing these 4 different things, you will create a piece of work that is much more analytical, and this should reflect in a much better piece of work. So hopefully you found this useful.